afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for joining us today for this panel on how the US government is responding to digital harm to children and youth globally. I hosted this panel at our first symposium back in 2022, and I'm very happy to be back here again with some of the same folks and some new folks as well. So this Safer Internet Day, I am joined by Kaylin Crockett, who's Director of Military Personnel and Readiness and the National Security Council Senior Advisor on the White House Gender Policy Council. Also joined by Steve Grocke, Chief of the Child Exploitation and Obscenity Section in the U.S. Department of Justice Criminal Division. We also have Ben Leroy, a Senior Policy Advisor in the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy at the U.S. Department of State. And finally, Andres Villaveses, a Senior Scientist in the Field Epidemiology and Prevention Branch, Division of Violence Prevention at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So thank you so much to our esteemed panelists for joining us, and thank you to everyone for tuning in from around the world. I'm sure many of us watched some of the big tech leaders testifying before the US Congress last week. It's clear that this topic is a concern to governments around the world, and it's also a challenge that has no borders. At USAID, our work to prevent and respond to violence against children and youth is guided by our digital strategy, as well as our Advancing Protection and Care for Children in Adversity strategy, which has three interrelated objectives. The first one is to build strong beginnings and promote early childhood development. The second one is to put family first, supporting protective family care for all children. And our third objective is to protect children from violence. At USAID, we have invested millions and have significant evidence in terms of what works on preventing and responding to both gender-based violence and violence against children and youth. And in the past few years, we've really been turning more focus and attention to digital harm and technology-facilitated gender-based violence. We know there's a gender digital divide, and one that's more prevalent in low and middle income countries, and that gender also impacts users' experience with the internet. And technology-facilitated gender-based violence has the dual effect of actively harming individuals and groups and also disincentivizing them from using the internet and digital tools. This can further the gender-digital divide and also lead to physical violence offline and other psychological, social, and emotional and economic impacts, particularly for women and LGBTQI+ individuals. As has been discussed throughout this symposium, the case is similar for children and youth. We know that children who are vulnerable in the physical world are also vulnerable online. And as more and more children and youth get online and are connected digitally, we see that the incidence of these digital harms is increasing. So we know we can't do our jobs protecting children from violence if we aren't meaningfully engaged in this digital space. And we're so excited to host this symposium with all of the information and experts that we're putting out there. Many of our US government partners have been working in the space of digital harm for a while and have been globally recognized for their work in child protection, including identifying and prosecuting those individuals who perpetrate crimes against children online. Each department and agency represented here within the US government has its own role in the multi-sectoral response that's needed, and I'm so excited to have our partners here today to share more about their work. So with that, I'd like to start off by asking each person to share a little bit more about what their agency does in this space to protect children and youth from digital harm. And especially for those of you who were here in 2022 on a similar panel, what are some of the changes and what's some of the progress that you have made since that time? And we'll kick it off. Let's first start with Kaylin to hear about how the White House is addressing these issues. Over to you, Kaylin.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. I want to commend you for holding this now for the third year in a row as this issue becomes more and more timely. Preventing and addressing digital harm to children, youth, and other populations disproportionately impacted by online harassment and abuse, including women and girls, communities of color, and LGBTQI+ individuals, has been a priority for the Biden-Harris administration since day one. Of course, Rebecca so eloquently expressed, we know that the digital world holds immense potential to amplify the voices of women and girls, but far too often that potential is undermined by tech-facilitated gender-based violence and other forms of online harassment and abuse. Simply put, the scale, reach, and amplification of technology platforms have exacerbated the scourge of gender-based violence and child exploitation. And because online harassment and abuse is borderless, resolving this 21st century challenge requires collaboration across countries and sectors. And we've been really working at this since the Summit for Democracy in 2021, when the Biden-Harris administration pledged to form the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse, alongside Denmark and other nations. We launched this partnership formally at the Commission on the Status of Women in 2022, and since then, the Global Partnership has grown to 14 countries that together have committed to prioritize, understand, prevent, and address the growing scourge of technology-facilitated gender-based violence. Since its launch, the Biden-Harris administration, together with our partners, have built a global coalition of stakeholders, including government, international organizations, civil society, and the private sector, to accelerate progress towards safe and accountable online spaces for women and girls and children, and thereby promoting more resilient democracies. Because we want to really be clear here that the cost of online violence is not only the individual harms, but also the cumulative societal impacts that impede the full contributions of diverse voices to question, to dissent, to engage in the political process. And we also see the intergenerational impacts of girls observing the cost that so many women leaders are paying to engage online. We've also been really focused on making sure we're leaving no stone unturned across our domestic policy landscape here in the US, recognizing what we're able to do within the existing authorities of the executive branch. And to that end, on June 16th, 2022, President Biden established the White House Task Force to address online harassment and abuse, with a mandate to develop concrete actions to prevent and address online harm. The memorandum creating the task force required submission of a blueprint outlining a whole of government approach, the initial blueprint of which we published an executive summary online about a year ago, and we are working on finalizing this task force report and blueprint to come out later this spring. A few quick highlights. Since the creation of the White House Task Force, the administration has taken numerous actions in line with our commitment to addressing online harassment and abuse, both domestically and globally. And our work to address online harassment and abuse has continued to evolve and respond to the rapid advancements of new and emerging technology and its impact on survivors, including the rise of generative artificial intelligence. A few quick highlights, and then I'm really excited for my other colleagues across the interagency who've been plowing away at this to chime in and to present their impressive work. But a few quick snapshots. We have launched a national 24/7 image-based abuse helpline. In September 23, just this fall, the Justice Department Office for Victims of Crime awarded a grant to the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative to establish the country's first national helpline for survivors of image-based abuse. We also saw the Surgeon General issue an advisory on social media and youth mental health last May. The Surgeon General's advisory concluded that based on the best available scientific evidence, we cannot determine that social media is sufficiently safe for children and youth. The advisory provides a scientific summary of the impact of social media on the mental health and well-being of youth, and also highlights the disproportionate safety risks to children and youth, including women and girls, including sexual exploitation and extortion, which we also know is a rising threat, particularly targeting adolescent boys that I'm sure Steve will touch on. We've launched a kids online health and safety task force, and we've also addressed deepfake image-based abuse in the president's executive order on artificial intelligence. We are working aggressively in partnership with other countries to address the rising threat of the financial extortion of minors, a transnational organized crime, through international law enforcement efforts, cooperation, diplomatic engagements, public awareness, and victim care and support. And finally, just in closing, we continue to elevate online harassment and abuse as a priority for international coordination. A few recent examples: in November, the administration announced support for the French Children's Online Protection Lab, We have launched a US-Australia Joint Council on countering online child sexual exploitation, and both initiatives truly build on the administration's ongoing leadership of the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse. With that, I look forward to hearing from other colleagues. And again, thank you so much to USAID for holding this discussion. And thanks to all of the global partners from civil society, industry, other countries, international organizations who are on the line today. This is truly a global effort, and I'm really inspired by the sheer number of everyone attending today and engaging. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kaylin. Yeah, this is certainly a problem that can feel really overwhelming and daunting at times, but it's very inspiring to hear about so many of the practical tools and resources that have happened just since 2022. So thank you for sharing that. Steve, I'll turn it over to you to share more about Department of Justice.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to USAID for the invitation to join. Always good to be with friends and partners across the U.S. government from different agencies that are clearly focusing, as you just heard from Kaylin, on this really important topic. I've been the chief of my section at the Department of Justice for the past 7 years, and in the section for almost 20 years, and sort of evolved in that time along with the internet, and sort of seen how not only how the crime continues to change and the online harms that children suffer, which is our focus, of course, how that changes, but also the response to that. And so, I'll start with sort of what has changed since 2022, which I think was sort of central to your question. And one very obvious way, what has changed is I think that the response, as we heard both within the United States as well as internationally, which I'll get to in a second, has really, it really has been amplified, and that we've seen responses from the UK with the recent passage of their online safety bill, which is now law, which is a regulatory framework that will apply to industry, the introduction in the EU of a similar regulatory framework, the hearing that you mentioned last week, and the focus in Congress, where you had a bipartisan committee with 22, I think, representatives in the U.S. Questioning 5 of the major U.S. Online platform CEOs, and really unified in their approach, in the sense that they all agreed, maybe not exactly on how to deal with the problem, but that they all agreed that there is a problem and it's significant and it needs to be dealt with, and in particular that the internet community needs to take a greater level of responsibility and accountability when it comes to that. So that's sort of all start as like a positive of like what has changed in the last 2 years. One way I can focus in my comments with the couple minutes that I have is that in the Department of Justice, we're obviously focused on investigation, prosecution, which you mentioned. My role, though, also fits heavily in the policy and legislative space. And we released a national strategy document that is publicly available on Department of Justice website. Simply Google Department of Justice National Strategy, and it'll show you the link. And it's a summary document. It's a report to Congress. That's a relatively short document. It's about 26 pages. And it outlines both the view of the threat. So the threat that is changing, and it encapsulates that threat in 3 key ways, which is the scale, the complexity of that threat, and then the dangerousness of it. And so we attempted to encapsulate all the platforms that this type of these harms and exploitations occurring for children, whether it be the well-known platforms like Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, those platforms, but also areas that are perhaps less well-known, like the dark web, other peer-to-peer systems. And that, online child exploitation really does permeate all areas of the internet, and it encompasses the full lifespan of, or the childhood, I should say, from 0 all the way up to 17. We have dark web forums that are dedicated to the abuse of infants and toddlers. And then we have, of course, the financial sextortion that is a relatively recent phenomenon that Kaylin mentioned. And I think I'll be able to get into more detail on that during the second question as kind of a key priority for us. But since 2022, in that strategy document, it also focuses on our response to that threat as it's manifesting in a couple key ways. One is legislation. So in the US, we had 150 pages that are actually public facing of recommended legislative proposals that went over to Congress. In the hearing last week, they focused on 5 bills, Stop CSAM being probably the key among them, that address a real collection of sort of gaps in our law here in the US, from victim protections and privacy help to them when they're involved in cases, to internet industry accountability or transparency requirements, report and remove requirements where content is reported to a provider and they can be penalized if they do not remove it within 48 hours. So there's a lot of legislation out there that's pending in the US. There's a lot of legislation pending globally. And, we're hopeful that with that hearing last week and getting some of these things on the Senate floor, that we'll actually see laws enacted, which has been elusive, to say the least. But the strategy does cover that as well. On the policy front, we have been engaging both domestically, as you see with this group here, and Kayla mentioned all the work that's coming out of the White House, and we're involved with that task force. We're involved domestically with our state and local partners, internet crimes against children task forces around the country, as well as we're engaged kind of on the policy front on a variety of different issues. Internationally, similarly, we're engaging with our international partners through a Five Eyes, or so UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. The Five Eye group comes together both with the purpose of unifying its message to industry where it's possible to do so, as well as through engagement. Again, trying to get more focus in our culture and in a standard of care across internet platforms, so that they are prioritizing online child safety as a key priority and not just sort of something they do as an afterthought. In addition to that, we engaged with G7. There's a working group that's been meeting for the past 2 years, since 2022. And then UNODC, as well as the UN, even as I speak, we are involved in some conversations about a treaty and language affecting child exploitation within that up in New York this week. So, and the one I should highlight, which again, since 2022 has been significant, is We Protect Global Alliance. So We Protect Global Alliance is probably the largest multi-stakeholder organization dedicated to combating online child exploitation. It has over 100 countries. It has over 50 internet and other private industry representatives, as well as significant representation from civil society. And we engaged through that organization, which released its own threat assessment just this past fall, has a summit coming up at the end of this year, and continues to sort of, I think, be a strategic global focus in this particular space. So a lot of change and I think positive response, a lot of change in the threat, which I'll get into more in the second question, but we wouldn't have talked about 2 years ago either financial sextortion involving young boys in the US and across the globe, and we wouldn't have been talking about generative AI, CSAM. Those are 2 issues that are key priorities. I'll get to those when we come back on the second question. But thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Steve. Yeah, you have such a kind of, I guess, sort of close view of some of the worst atrocities that happen, worst violence and atrocities that happen. It's hard to even hear about some of the dark web things that Department of Justice is tackling, but so important to shine the light on it and not shy away from those tough forms of violence and exploitation that are going on online. So thank you for sharing all of that. Next up, I'll turn over to Ben. So Ben, you were not with this panel 2 years ago, and I know that a lot has happened at the State Department since then. So look forward to hearing more about the State Department work. Over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks so much for the invitation for the on behalf of the State Department to include us in the conversation. I think it shows really the cross-cutting ways in which the United States is trying to address these online risks to children. And while protecting children from harm has long been a priority at the State Department, One significant change as it relates to the digital intersection, the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy, where I sit right now, did not actually even exist back in February of 2022. Our ribbon cutting took place a few months later in April of 2022, which was part of Secretary Antony Blinken's agenda to modernize the State Department, and in doing so, bringing together a team focused on integrating and elevating cyber and digital policies as really core to U.S. foreign policy. Our approach emphasizes an affirmative vision for cyberspace and digital technologies, working toward a future where people around the world use secure digital technologies to safely seek, receive, and impart information and ideas online, reliably receive critical services and information from their governments, raise standards of living, and drive inclusive economic growth. So what that means in practice is, to the extent that we can help bring together stakeholders from across the department to kind of bring everyone out of their individual silos and find a way to address this problem in a coordinated way, we're happy to play that role. I think stepping back and thinking kind of more broadly, as we spread the benefits of connectivity and all the inclusivity that it brings, we also need to take responsibility for the unintended harms that it may also bring, such as this growing and alarming problem of digital harm to children. So when we talk about this future, we must take into account how technologies are affecting children and young people today. That means we must focus both on digital inclusion, ensuring the benefits and opportunities of technology are accessible and empowering to all, as well as mitigating the risks and harms brought on by the misuse of those technologies. So while there's much work to be done, we're seeing a shift in international conversations around the seriousness of this issue, keeping children safe online. Working with our international partners, we are committed to ensuring that translates into meaningful action. And for our international partners, particularly ones working in governments abroad, the US government and State Department, we really want to work with you, and we want to find ways to collaborate. So feel free, whether it's in Washington here or in one of our overseas missions, to please reach out if you want to talk with us about some of the work that we're doing. We're happy to be that entry point so that we can share some of what we've learned within the US government as we work to try to stop this problem. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ben. And last but definitely not least, Andres from CDC. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and a real pleasure to be here again with you all. I want to echo some of the words that my two previous colleagues mentioned in terms of what has happened in the last 2 years. I think the strengthening of, from a policy perspective, from an intervention perspective, from a collaboration perspective, is something that has increased considerably in the international domain, certainly between countries, between different institutions in relation to this topic overall. As for what the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC does, I want to divide it into three sort of activities. One is the dissemination of information. We disseminate information on prevention strategies for communities to address violence, and that includes online violence through a variety of violence prevention resources, and on prevention strategies that are directed to parents, to teens, to youth, and to adults in general. One example of that is the stopbullying.gov website, which is actually developed in collaboration with the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, and other agencies of the Department of Health and Human Services. In addition to disseminating information through a variety of websites and tools that are provided, the CDC also funds state and local health departments and coalitions to address multiple forms of violence that include expressions of violence through online or technology-facilitated means, through programs, for example, such as the Rape Prevention Education Program. We also fund academic and community partners through the Youth Violence Prevention Centers. And the particular interest here is to help these centers or collaborate with academia and communities to develop, to implement, and rigorously evaluate interventions that prevent this type of violence in a variety of settings, including social media. And in these spaces, we have also worked in companies that use gaming tools to understand the decision-making processes of people and how the behaviors are in virtual spaces, so as to understand how to address a variety of prevention messages and understand how decisions are made. And lastly, we also work on collecting data and collecting information through a variety of resources, not only collecting data, but also developing better tools to collect information. As such, we have added questions to the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, NISFIS, which can now monitor technology-facilitated stalking and sexual violence among adults. We can also collect data on cyberbullying through the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System. We had previously worked on the Adolescent Behaviors and Experiences Survey, more to understand positive type of behaviors, connectedness, and how youth can better use technologies in a positive way. And in the international setting, we have increasingly strengthened and enhanced the type of questions that we ask through the Violence Against Children surveys. Of late, the one we're doing in Tanzania, for example, has included much more questions on child sexual exploitation and abuse, which include both questions that are online and technology facilitated and not technology facilitated, to understand those links between these forms of violence. So these contributions on collecting information, on enhancing data systems, all supplement the additional information that we provide both at the dissemination stage, but also help us develop additional tools on how we collect data. We're finally working on a child sexual exploitation perpetration module with colleagues in academia to try to measure and understand that type of behavior. So that's so those are in essence some of the summary activities that we have done or changed or improved since we last met here. Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Andres. Yes, so glad to have CDC's expertise in data collection and analytics to bring to bear on this, which really is a public health problem. And I thank you too for mentioning the work around bullying and Stop Bullying platform. I think you know, it's easy to be so horrified by some of the most extreme forms of violence and exploitation which happen, but the cumulative impact of some of these kinds of quote unquote everyday bullying we know can also be severe and have led to suicide and other things. So it's really important that we're looking at the whole spectrum of kinds of violence and abuse that happen online. So thanks for bringing that to this discussion. Okay, we do have one more question for the panelists. Looking ahead, what are some of your top priorities? Noting obviously that this is a constantly evolving digital world that we're dealing with. And I know we often do feel in some ways one step behind, but it would be great if each of you could share briefly your top priorities for the next few years looking ahead. So we'll start again with you, Kaylin.
Thanks, Rebecca. Priorities. I would say priority number one for the White House is really institutionalizing and creating sustainable pathways for this work to continue. There's obviously been a lot of momentum that this administration has integrated into the face of online harms, promoting accountability, particularly when it comes to children and youth and addressing gender-based violence online. But we know that this is going to be an evergreen issue. No matter the form of the tech, which will continually evolve, the disproportionate impacts will remain. And so we want to really make sure that every partnership that we have launched during this administration, every policy initiative or program that we have launched or invested in, that there is a really sustainable runway for this work to continue across administrations and across time and space. Truly, we really want to make sure that we're investing here in the long term and not just getting a few quick wins here and there. So sustainability is one, and then the other piece to just note here too is really making sure that We are looking, and this is a part of that sustainability and institutionalization, looking to our international partners, other governments in particular, that can join us in making commitments that this administration has made, particularly when it comes to getting some really concrete norms around how federal governments procure and make business choices around AI systems. That's a specific element of our executive order that we're happy to share more on, but we really want to set some international norms together with global partners to really maximize safe and healthy choices for kids online. And that has to start with, too, making sure that we are making informed and practical decisions, leading with our values and how we make decisions around technology products.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kaylin. And Steve, over to you for priorities from DOJ.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. I'll try and be quick. Probably our key number one priority, and it ties to sort of the evolving technology, but the key overarching priority is we've been working to change the culture of safety involving how children engage online. And I think that will continue to be, one of our top priorities. One way, we're seeing that is with these hearings and with pushes for increased accountability voluntarily in the US or through regulation across other parts of the world. But at the end of the day, I think we all know that these platforms are controlled and operated by companies, and that when you control the roadways, you have to make them as safe as possible. And so pivoting over to the other priority is that one way we're seeing that world evolve is through encryption. A lot of different thoughts about that, and certainly it's a debate that can rage. But at the end of the day, we know that moving to end-to-end encryption or other forms of encryption affects our ability to investigate and prosecute and detect crimes against children online. We need those platforms, if they move to encryption, to incorporate other forms of safety, to prevent direct messaging, for example, on Instagram, which was announced recently by Meta, or just other ways of ensuring that kids that are using platforms alongside adults are safe, and that they can ensure safety when they are clearly targeting the use of these platforms by kids. There's little doubt that TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, yes, there are a lot of adult users, but we have, millions and millions of child users. And so safety is going to be a key priority for us. Tied into that is the transparency and accountability I mentioned, and doing that again through regulation, law, as well as through voluntary measures by companies, which is working. Many of the companies that testified last week created child safety centers. So they all now have child safety centers on their platform. I think that parents and caregivers probably struggle to find those sometimes and know that they're there, but they are beginning to incorporate, resources to educate on how to change settings from defaults that may not be the most protective of children to enhancing those protections. So there's good movement there. I think one of the other priorities for us is going to be innovation. So using technology, we heard from our CDC friend Andre that these academic sort of studies and analytical studies on data that we have about how these crimes are happening, how these harms are happening online, needs to continue. It needs to continue at a greater pace and a greater scale. And so one way is there's a French child online protection lab that was formed just last year that we are supporting. State Department is supporting that, and so is the Justice Department and Homeland Security. The two crime areas I mentioned earlier, this is what I want to close on from a priority standpoint, that have emerged fully, just completely fully in the last 2 years, are first financially motivated sextortion. And so these are coming from a very specific part of the world. It is a part of the world in Africa, West Africa, that doesn't have certainly the capacity to be receiving thousands of cyber tips, which is happening. There's 21,000 last year just in the US alone. And so that's going to be a key priority for us, is trying to help build that capacity, build a system of response that can hold accountable those perpetrators and work to keep kids safe. We're also working with the companies like Instagram to try and improve their ability to interdict and support kids and make them safe, so that prevention, being key to that. So financial sextortion is something that globally we all need to get an understanding of and develop a good systemic response for, because it's bad enough for all of us to have to worry about offenders who are sexually motivated, and in their interest in children. But here is a financial motivation. These individuals are preying on children online simply because they know that they'll spend hundreds or even thousands of dollars through extortion means. The last I'll talk about is Gen AI, CSAM. This is just this year that it really has emerged and has been a subject area we have been spending a lot of time on. We are engaging with companies that are building AI models and trying to assist them in building responsible models that are preventative when it comes to producing CSAM. We are looking to identify and investigate and getting reports around CSAM creation by offenders. We are seeing that. There's no question that we're seeing the creation of CSAM using AI models. And so we have to ensure we have legal frameworks to deal with that. We have to ensure we have, mechanisms like cyber tip systems to deal with the Gen AI. And then we need to develop ways to identify a Gen AI image and distinguish it from an image involving an actual child, because so much of the world is involved in victim ID work, looking at images, trying to identify actual victims. The last thing we want is for them to be focusing on an image that is actually a virtual child and not a real child at all. So that's certainly on the horizon and something we're focused on. And that is not just the U.S. Everywhere in the world is talking about Gen AI, CSAM, and looking at ways to prevent that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Steve. I am glad there's some really smart people and experts who are thinking about how to get ahead of that, or at least catch up to that and be able to fight it as best as possible. For all of those folks out there on the Tech Change platform, audience members, if you do have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat and our tech moderator will get them over to us. So we appreciate your attention and your thoughts. And Ben, I'll turn to you next for a quick update on State Department priorities.
Thanks so much. And look, in addition to everything that Kaylin and Steve mentioned, state is obviously, we're very focused on supporting those frontline efforts and those administration priorities, and really pushing forward, stopping all of these harms, and ensuring that children have the ability to thrive in a safe and empowering digital environment. Maybe I'll highlight just a few areas in which the State Department is partnering with other governments and stakeholders through a variety of programs. The first one is the Child Protection Compact Partnership. Through this, the U.S. has focused on online sexual exploitation of children and related aspects in both the U.S.-Philippines partnership and the ongoing U.S.-Colombia partnership, along with additional anti-trafficking programming to support police officers identifying online child victims in Indonesia. Second, through the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse, the U.S. engages with 13 partner governments and other stakeholders in response to the pivotal need to address technology-facilitated gender-based violence as part of a shared global agenda to promote peace, security, and stability, recognizing that the chilling effects of technology-facilitated gender-based violence on the civic and political participation of women, girls, and LGBTQI+ persons undermines this agenda. Next, the State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, or INL, also funds capacity building programs that include law enforcement training and technical assistance for foreign partners in combating cybercrime and cyber-enabled crimes, which can include countering online child sexual exploitation and abuse. Lines of effort feature the U.S. Transnational and High-Tech Crime Global Law Enforcement Network, or GLEN, which delivers regional workshops and mentoring to prosecutors, investigators, judges, and border and customs officials led by Department of Justice International Computer Hacking and Intellectual Property Advisors and DOJ's Global Cyber Forensics Advisors. And new regional cryptocurrency working groups also provide foreign law enforcement partners with the skills and tools to address criminal misuse of cryptocurrency and online child sexual exploitation and abuse, often delivering this assistance via the INL Global Network of International Law Enforcement Academies, the ILEAs. Everyone loves those. INL also supports DHS HSI to assist the governments in Southeast Asia to detect, disrupt, and prosecute criminals involved in the sexual exploitation and trafficking of children. Finally, INL provides funding support to multilateral partners such as the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the Council of Europe, who complement the GLEN by delivering similar capacity building. Fourth, recognizing the need for innovation, creative solutions, the United States announced in November our support for the French-led Child Online Protection Laboratory, which brings together other governments, tech companies, and civil society to break down silos and address a range of online safety challenges. Finally, at the people-to-people level, the department focuses on important themes like digital literacy in our international exchange programs. Last fall, for example, a group of 24 young people from Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru traveled to the United States for over 2 weeks, exploring the topic of mis- and disinformation and how generative AI is impacting the information space. Upon their return home, they then completed follow-on projects to share what they had learned with their communities. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ben. So many fascinating programs and lines of work. Really appreciate you sharing them. Andres, I'll turn it over to you for a short recap of CDC priorities.
Certainly. Well, within the increased desire for collaborating globally, I think what I'm going to highlight here is the importance of collecting more information. There are still so many gaps in so many countries where we don't know what is really happening in these spaces. So the collection of information is really important, not only to measure victimization from the perspectives of different forms and expressions of technology-facilitated violence, but also to understand and measure how people behave within these types of settings, and as well how people use technology either in positive or in negative ways. To this effect, I think it's really important to understand that in this space, you've heard of a lot of terminology. A lot of new technologies are coming up, and tied to that, many concepts of behaviors are attached to that. But we don't have a standard definition of that relates to many of those concepts or behaviors. So prioritizing or developing a standard type of classification, as we do with so many other problems, in order to be able to measure them across countries in a similar way, I think it's an incredibly important issue that we need to tackle in the spirit of strengthening this collaboration. Finally, just to echo some of Ben's statements, I think the work, for example, that he mentioned in Colombia, we have work there also, and we have been working on developing national action plans for the prevention of violence against children. That with our government partners, the issues of online violence come up constantly. And so joining and merging a lot of these activities within those larger frameworks of collaboration is extremely important. That's about it for my part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andres. We don't have a lot of time left in the panel, but we did get one question from an audience member that I'd like to turn over to Steve. So that question is, what do you see as the role of verified parental consent, VPC, age gating mechanisms on some of these social media platforms, and how could those be strengthened? So thanks, Steve, for your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, and one that sort of highlights where our laws, especially in the U.S., need to be updated desperately. So first, the idea of the verified parental consent comes from, at least in the U.S., from COPPA, the Child Online Privacy Protection Act. A couple of interesting things, like how could that be strengthened? Number one, COPPA sets the age of majority essentially at 13. And so I think that, across the spectrum of social media companies, if you look at almost all of them, they also choose 13 as the age of appropriateness that they broadcast for their platforms. And so despite the complexity of both the platform itself, the use of algorithms, the connectivity, things that adults struggle to understand how to use. All the safety mechanisms sit in the hands of the user. So whether I report, how I report, an individual, whether I block an individual, whether I, engage in communications or allow them to follow me, all those are in the hands of the user. And companies are setting the age at 13. And so I think a good question for them is always, why? Why are you choosing 13? Is it COPPA? COPPA was a privacy rule. It wasn't safety oriented. There is a proposal in the Senate bill to actually elevate that age to 16. And so that may have fairly dramatic impacts. The other sort of limitation within that's inherent is that the COPPA rules are supposed to be child-directed services. And so there's been a lot of question of like, what is a child-directed service online? Is Instagram a child-directed service? Is Snapchat? The answer is generally no, that those are directed not specifically just to children. They're mixed audience. And so we're missing a huge portion of the online social media presence because their platforms aren't specifically directed at children alone. The one exception to that would probably be Facebook Messenger for kids, right? Which isn't that heavily used by kids, but that's one that is directed exclusively to kids. So that's one way that needs to be changed and needs to be strengthened. I think another way is that we're missing is just fundamental transparency. And so you can't have a system of parental consent, verified parental consent to do certain things involving kids when those parents themselves have no information about the safety or privacy practices of a particular platform. Like if they are operating in a vacuum, as most of us are, as to how these decisions are made, why they're made, why they choose 13, why, what are the safety features that are employed? What are the vulnerabilities? What is the risk? Right? Where does a parent go to understand the actual risk that a particular platform might pose to a child? I think that parents are largely and caregivers are in the dark. And so even if you increase the age, increase the scope, and actually implement it in a meaningful way, parents don't have the information. And so they're just going to click yes. Like we see that already, right? They're just allowing kids to have access to these platforms. The other issue is, and I'll stop with this one because this is kind of the lowest hanging fruit, and I stress this every time I talk about online child safety, is that in the US, I can't speak for other countries, but in the US, if you look at the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, you will see an age rating in that. And for these social media companies, it says 12 plus. That seems to be, this is what they're saying is this platform's appropriate for that age. It's not what it actually means. It's speaking to the content one person might see using a platform. So infrequent at 12 plus, infrequent sexual content is what the platform provider broadcasts essentially through the App Store. And, you have platforms doing that, even though they're submitting, 500,000 cyber tips for sexualized content involving kids, let alone other adults. So it's just misleading, and when you look at those app stores, there is no information about safety. There's a lot about privacy, but there's no information about safety, and it's an easy, quick hit, and that's not even happening voluntarily right now. So those are sort of the deficiencies within a verified parental consent. I think that overall, there are a lot of good things that could come out of a system that is built, that works, that requires parental consent, particularly for children under 16. But it also has to be done thoughtfully, and it has to be done carefully because there is a counter viewpoint, and we need to be mindful of that, of where certain apps, certain things that children are using to find others that they can communicate with and find comfort in that communication. So friends, similarly situated, LGBTQ minors and youth, parents might inhibit that. They might prevent that if it's a platform they think is specifically engineered toward that. So we have to find the right balance in that and fight the right age. But where I work, where I have cases involving 8 to 10-year-olds using Snapchat and sending explicit videos to adult men who are engaging them, it's hard to not look at that scenario and say something is broken and we need to change the way we're doing things. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Steve. I have so many important points. I'm a parent and also someone whose professional work touches this space, and I still feel like I don't really know, exactly what I should be doing in regards to my children online usage. So I probably have access to relatively more information than many people. So I think that's such an important point that even if parents are approving something, they don't have enough information, and we don't have enough information about some of these issues as a society yet to be able to really make, I think, clear evidence-based decisions at some point. So we're thankful for Andres sharing a lot of what CDC is trying to do to tackle that, but there's still so much to be done. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. There's a plethora of other events going on as part of the symposium, so really encourage folks out there listening to join some of the others. USAID has an amazing digital youth council of youth leaders and digital leaders around the world who are informing some of USAID's steps and policies on this through their experience. So the Digital Youth Council has been a key part of this symposium and lots of other impressive sessions. I want to give an additional thanks to all of the panelists here today. As the U.S. government special advisor for children and diversity, I know just how much our work and our success depends on the collaboration of government agencies together, working as an interagency to address protection issues for children and youth. And I think this was a really nice demonstration of just how much the U.S. government is doing together. I won't try to recap it all here, but just, if you think about the breadth of things that we're doing to tackle this problem, from really getting more and better data, through some of CDC's efforts, the capacity building efforts with law enforcement in other countries, because we know anywhere there's a weak link, anyone can exploit that in a globally connected system. So some of those capacity building efforts are really incredible. And I hadn't heard about some of those exchange programs with youth, but I think that's just another key part of really putting youth at the forefront of some of these solutions that we're going to need to tackle this problem. So thank you. It's really been impressive to see the progress that we've made over the last 2 years since we last spoke together at this panel. But obviously there's just so much risk still out there, and so many harms that are still happening. So I know that all of us and our respective agencies will sort of continue all of our work streams and try to innovate and keep doing more to get more ahead of this problem. So again, on behalf of USAID and especially the Children and Diversity team, I just want to thank everyone so much for your participation and support.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Have a good one.
Thank you. All right. Take care.